There are moments that change everything, moments when a single decision means the difference between life and death. For Lasagna Agee, that moment came on a cold February morning in Chicago, when she made the brave choice to say one simple word: no. What happened next would shock an entire community and leave 3 people fighting for their lives. But to understand how this ordinary morning erupted into violence, we need to go back to where it all began. If you're new to True Crime Watch HD, take a moment to subscribe and join our community of critical thinkers who seek to understand the complex human stories behind these events. Chicago, 2017. 24-year-old Lasagna Agee was building the life she'd always dreamed of. A dedicated postal worker by day, she was also growing her own cosmetics business, determined to create a better future for herself and her newborn son. Her colleagues knew her as the woman who always arrived early, worked hard, and never complained. But they didn't know the weight she carried behind her smile. The father of her child, Larry, had entered her life like so many others before him, with charm, with promises, with what seemed like love. But as their son grew from infant to toddler, something else grew too: Larry's need for control. It started small. A comment about her clothing. Questions about her whereabouts. Suggestions that turned into demands. Then came the day she found herself explaining away her first bruise. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love change before your eyes? How do you recognize the moment when love transforms into something else entirely? For Lasagna, that recognition came at a devastating cost. She would later tell investigators that the control extended beyond her personal life. When she managed to save enough money to buy her own car, a symbol of independence, Larry deliberately crashed it into a garage. When she secured her own apartment, he found ways to force his way in, violating restraining orders and leaving her with shattered windows as a reminder of his rage. But Lasagna was more than just a victim. She was a survivor with an unbreakable spirit. Even as her world contracted under Larry's influence, she continued working, continued planning, continued believing in the possibility of freedom. Her colleagues at the post office noticed her circling the building before leaving work, and they began taking turns walking her to her car. Small acts of kindness that would later prove crucial to her story. What's particularly chilling about this case is how the systems designed to protect people like Lasagna repeatedly failed her. Police reports piled up. Restraining orders were filed. Yet Larry remained free to escalate his campaign of terror. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Someone at work, someone she thought she could trust, fabricated a story about her stealing mail. The accusation was false, but it cost Lasagna her job. For many, this would have been the breaking point. For Lasagna, it became the catalyst for her most courageous decision yet. But before we continue with what happened next, I want you to think about something. What makes someone stay in a situation they know is dangerous? The answer isn't as simple as many people think, and Lasagna's story is about to show us why. The human spirit is remarkable in its capacity to endure, but even more remarkable in its ability to finally say enough. For Lasagna, that moment arrived after years of calculated abuse, but freedom would come at a terrible price. Early 2021 found Lasagna working tirelessly to rebuild her life. Despite losing her postal service job, she refused to give up. She saved every dollar she could, searching for a new apartment while carefully hiding her plans from Larry. But in an age of social media and constant connection, secrets have a way of unraveling. One day, while scrolling through her phone, Larry discovered a photo of her new car, a vehicle she had purposely kept hidden from him. What followed was a scene that would replay in Lasagna's mind for months to come. Within hours of discovering the photo, Larry tracked down the car and, in a display of raw destructive power, rammed it into a pole, shattering every window. But the violence didn't stop there. Armed with a bat, he chased Lasagna through the streets of Chicago, forcing her to run for her life. Yet perhaps the most psychologically devastating act was still to come. In what can only be described as psychological warfare, Larry took their young son and disappeared. His message was clear. If Lasagna wanted to see her child again, she would have to maintain their relationship. When she reported this to local authorities, they delivered a crushing blow. Since Larry was the boy's father, this was considered a custody matter. They advised her to handle it through the courts. Think about that for a moment. A man who had repeatedly violated restraining orders, destroyed property, and demonstrated escalating violent behavior was deemed safe enough to retain custody rights. This reveals a frightening gap in our legal system, one that leaves countless victims trapped in the machinery of bureaucracy while danger grows closer. The pattern of abuse had become a twisted dance, destruction followed by demands, threats followed by false promises. Each time Lasagna attempted to break free, the consequences grew more severe. Her family and friends found themselves caught in the crossfire, receiving threatening messages and calls. The weight of responsibility for their safety added another chain to Lasagna's already heavy burden. But February 21, 2021, would change everything. The morning began like any other, with Lasagna going about her daily routine. The winter air was crisp, and the streets of Chicago's South Side were starting to come alive with activity. She had no way of knowing that Larry had been watching, waiting, planning. As she stepped out of her vehicle in the 7800 block of South Muskegon, Larry's car pulled up alongside her. The security cameras that would later capture this moment showed a scene that started with a conversation, a scene that plays out on streets across America every day. But this one would end very differently. Larry begged Lasagna to get in his car. Perhaps he sensed that his control was slipping away. Perhaps he knew that this time, she really was ready to leave for good. Whatever the reason, his desperation had reached a breaking point. In that moment, standing on a Chicago street with her young son nearby, Lasagna made the decision that would nearly cost her her life. She said no. She refused to get in his car. She chose freedom over fear. What happened next would be captured not only by security cameras but would echo through social media in a chilling series of live broadcasts that would shock viewers across the country. Larry, the man who had claimed to love her, reached for his weapon. The first shot rang out, then another and another. In total, 11 bullets would tear through Lasagna's body. But Larry wasn't finished. In what investigators would later describe as an attempt to eliminate witnesses, he turned his gun on Lasagna's grandmother and uncle, firing 8 more times. Most horrifying of all, as Lasagna lay bleeding on the pavement, Larry turned his weapon toward the car where their young son sat watching the nightmare unfold. He emptied his clip into the vehicle, firing every remaining bullet he had. In the chaos that followed, as emergency responders rushed to the scene and 3 victims fought for their lives, Larry did something unexpected. He went live on Facebook, broadcasting a series of confessions that would provide a rare and disturbing glimpse into the mind of an abuser in the immediate aftermath of violence. The immediate aftermath of the shooting created a haunting digital footprint, one that would give investigators and the public an unprecedented look into the mind of someone who had just committed an unthinkable act of violence. Larry's Facebook Live broadcasts, streaming just moments after he pulled the trigger, revealed a man caught between remorse and justification, between love and hate, between his actions and their consequences. "I love that woman dearly," he repeated over and over during his stream, his voice breaking with emotion. But these proclamations of love stood in stark contrast to the brutality of his actions just moments before. As viewers watched in real time, Larry cycled through a range of emotions, from confusion about what drove him to snap, to declarations that he wouldn't run from the consequences, to moments of apparent realization about what he had done. Meanwhile, at the University of Chicago Medical Center, doctors were fighting to save 3 lives. Lasagna had been hit 11 times, with bullets concentrated in her pelvis and right leg. Her grandmother and uncle, both struck 8 times, were also in critical condition. The medical team would later describe their survival as nothing short of miraculous. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story was yet to come. As Lasagna lay in her hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her, she made a decision that would transform her personal tragedy into a powerful message of hope and warning for others. Despite her injuries, despite the trauma, despite the very real fear that Larry was still at large, she chose to speak out. "He only hit me 11 times, she would later tell reporters, her voice steady despite the pain. "That's how many times he hit me. That doesn't count the bullet holes in my car." The clinical way she recounted these details masked a deeper truth. Each of those 11 bullets represented a failure of the system to protect her, a system that had repeatedly dismissed her fears and minimized her danger. As Lasagna recovered in her hospital room, a different kind of battle was taking place on the streets of Chicago. Law enforcement launched a massive manhunt for Larry, who had fled the scene after his social media confessions. The search would stretch across state lines, becoming a complex interstate investigation that would test the coordination of multiple law enforcement agencies. During this time, Lasagna faced another kind of terror, the fear that Larry would return to finish what he started. She knew better than anyone what he was capable of, and her hospital room became both a place of healing and a prison of fear. Security was tight, but the psychological wounds ran deeper than any bullet. Her 3-year-old son, who had witnessed the entire attack, showed remarkable resilience in the face of trauma. "Come on, Mama," he had said during the shooting, trying to help his mother as she lay bleeding on the pavement. The impact of witnessing such violence on a child's developing mind would become another layer of this tragic story, one that would require long-term therapeutic intervention. The investigation revealed disturbing details about the level of premeditation involved in the attack. Security footage showed that Larry had been watching Lasagna's movements, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This wasn't a crime of passion, as his emotional Facebook broadcasts might have suggested. It was calculated, planned, and executed with chilling precision. As news of the shooting spread through Chicago's South Side community, other women began coming forward with their own stories of domestic violence. Lasagna's tragedy had opened a dialogue about the often invisible nature of domestic abuse and the challenges victims face when trying to leave their abusers. Statistics show that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they attempt to leave, a fact that Lasagna's case tragically illustrated. The ripple effects of the shooting extended far beyond Chicago. Domestic violence advocates across the country began using Lasagna's story to highlight the need for better protection for victims, more substantial consequences for restraining order violations, and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies. Her case became a rallying cry for legislative change and increased funding for domestic violence prevention programs. But the story wasn't over. As Lasagna continued her physical recovery, investigators received a crucial tip that would lead them to Louisiana, where Larry had fled in an attempt to evade capture. The subsequent arrest operation would involve federal marshals, local law enforcement, and careful coordination to ensure no one else would be hurt in the process of bringing him to justice. His capture would bring only partial relief to Lasagna and her family. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological impact of the attack continued to reverberate through their lives. Every unexpected noise, every car that drove past slowly, every stranger's glance carried the weight of potential threat. This is the reality for survivors of domestic violence. The trauma doesn't end when the physical danger passes. Before we continue with the conclusion of this powerful story, if you've been following along and haven't yet joined our True Crime Watch HD community, now is the moment to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light and could help save lives by raising awareness about domestic violence. The arrest of Larry in Louisiana marked the beginning of a new chapter in this harrowing story. After a carefully coordinated operation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, he was taken into custody and extradited back to Chicago to face justice. The charges were severe: 3 counts of attempted murder and 3 counts of aggravated battery. Each charge carried the weight of years of systematic abuse, years of violated restraining orders, and years of a system that had failed to protect a mother and her child. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence that painted a disturbing picture of calculated violence. The surveillance footage showed Larry's car circling the neighborhood multiple times before the shooting, suggesting premeditation. His social media broadcasts, initially seeming like emotional outbursts, were analyzed by forensic psychologists who identified patterns of manipulation common among domestic abusers, the alternating expressions of love and violence, the self-pity mixed with threats, the attempts to control the narrative even after committing horrific acts of violence. The case sparked intense debate within Chicago's legal community about the effectiveness of restraining orders and the need for reform in how domestic violence cases are handled. Statistics revealed a troubling truth. Lasagna's case, while extreme in its violence, followed a predictable pattern. Research shows that domestic violence victims attempt to leave their abusers an average of 7 times before successfully breaking free. Each attempt to leave increases the risk of lethal violence. For Lasagna, the road to recovery was long and complex. Physical therapy sessions helped her regain mobility, but the psychological healing proved more challenging. She underwent extensive trauma therapy, working to process not only the shooting but the years of abuse that preceded it. Her grandmother and uncle, also survivors of the attack, joined her in family therapy sessions, working to rebuild their sense of safety and trust. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of recovery involved Lasagna's young son. Child psychologists worked carefully with him, using play therapy and art therapy to help him process the trauma of witnessing such violence. The impact of domestic violence on children often extends far beyond the immediate crisis, affecting their emotional development, their ability to form relationships, and their understanding of what constitutes healthy love. As Lasagna's story gained attention, she made a remarkable decision. Instead of retreating into anonymity, she chose to become an advocate for domestic violence awareness. Speaking from her hospital bed, she delivered a message that would resonate with victims across the country. It's not worth it. You see me. I got shot 11 times by someone I loved, someone I shared a child with. Everybody may not be as blessed to have a second chance to tell their story. Her words struck a chord with domestic violence organizations nationwide. They highlighted a crucial truth: leaving an abuser is not as simple as walking away. It requires resources, support, and often, tremendous courage in the face of escalating danger. Lasagna's case became a teaching tool for law enforcement, social workers, and domestic violence advocates, illustrating the need for comprehensive support systems for victims attempting to escape abuse. The legal proceedings against Larry revealed additional disturbing details about the extent of his controlling behavior. Evidence presented in court showed hundreds of threatening text messages, documented instances of stalking, and testimony from witnesses who had seen the progression of abuse but felt powerless to intervene. The case highlighted a common phenomenon in domestic violence situations: the isolation of victims through both direct threats and indirect manipulation of their support systems. In an unexpected development, several other women came forward during the trial, sharing their own experiences with Larry. Their stories revealed a pattern of behavior that stretched back years before his relationship with Lasagna. This information proved crucial in the prosecution's case, demonstrating a long-standing pattern of domestic violence that contradicted the defense's attempts to portray the shooting as an isolated incident fueled by emotional distress. The broader impact of Lasagna's case extended into policy discussions at both the local and state level. Legislators began examining the gaps in existing domestic violence laws, particularly focusing on the enforcement of restraining orders and the need for better protection for victims during the high-risk period when they attempt to leave their abusers. Advocacy groups pointed to the numerous times Lasagna had sought help through official channels, only to find the system inadequate to protect her. The Chicago Police Department initiated a review of their domestic violence response protocols, acknowledging that multiple opportunities to intervene had been missed. They began implementing new training programs for officers, emphasizing the recognition of escalating danger signs and the importance of taking protective order violations seriously. The department also started developing better coordination with domestic violence advocacy groups, creating more comprehensive support networks for victims. Today, Lasagna continues to heal, both physically and emotionally. Her story serves as both a warning and a beacon of hope, a reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic violence, but also of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. She has become an inspiration for others trapped in abusive relationships, proving that survival is possible, that help is available, and that no one should have to face such battles alone. The questions her case raises continue to resonate. How do we better protect those trying to escape abuse? What changes are needed in our legal system to prevent similar tragedies? And perhaps most importantly, how do we break the cycle of domestic violence before it escalates to such dangerous levels? These questions remain critically important in our ongoing dialogue about domestic violence, justice, and the protection of vulnerable individuals in our society. Lasagna's story reminds us that behind every domestic violence statistic is a real person, fighting for their life and their freedom, deserving of our support and protection.